I don't know if you have ever critically thought about the idea of suffering, but what is suffering? I came up with a word, and back in preacher school, they probably told me I couldn't say this here. I don't know exactly what suffering it is, but I know that it sucks. Right? I got in trouble in preacher school. I was a little, can't say words like that up on the stage. Well, that's what suffering is, right? I don't know exactly what it is, but I know that it sucks. That's what suffering is. In fact, if you were to go, look up the definition, you'd find something like the state of undergoing pain, distress, or hardship. For a simple little country kid like me, it sucks, right? That's what suffering is going through a hard time, a hard thing, pain, stress, whatever it might be. And here's the fact of the matter. Everybody's going to suffer. Everybody's going to suffer. In this life, we are humans who are cursed by sin, and we will suffer. We will suffer. And that's such a hard thing for us to grasp as humans because we know it, but we don't want to know it. And one of the things that when people become Christians, it's easy for us to be like, okay, if you become a Christian, suffering will go away. But that ain't true. In fact, if we look at chapter 2 and what we're going to look at here in chapter 3, chapter 4, it's not the fact that suffering is going to go away, but the suffering that you're going to endure is going to change reasons for enduring it. You might be suffering before coming to Christ because of all the sin in your life. Absolutely. A lot of sins have terrible consequences that bring a lot of suffering. If you look at families that are in distress, you can say that they're suffering, and you can look and probably find some sins that are causing it. But when you become a Christian, it doesn't just go away. In fact, now you suffer because of Christ and because Christ suffered for you. So the one thing that I always tell people, I try and scare them away when they're going to become a Christian is your suffering is not going to go away. In fact, what you're doing right now is painting the biggest target on your back for Satan that you can ever do because you're telling him he's losing. So now Satan's going to bring you suffering. And on top of that, God might bring you suffering too to build you into a better Christian. Again, not a great place to stop the sermon. Not very encouraging, right? But we are indeed called to suffer. Whether that's a hard thing for us to wrap our heads around or not. Suffering is a hard thing to explain. It's a hard thing to put on definition. And like I said, it's something that stinks. It's something that sucks. And we all know what it is. I think suffering is really unique. Before we dive into chapter 3 here, suffering is really unique because I think one of the reasons it's so hard to define is because you can't define it with examples because each and every person might have different examples that are suffering to them and not to someone else. Or on the other inverse, something that's not suffering to me might be suffering to you. Like starving to death. That would be suffering for most humans. That's a pretty good all around. Some people might be better with that than me, though.
Or thirst to death.
Thirst to death? How about I give you a really, really shallow one? This was the one I thought of. What?
Lonely to death.
Lonely to death. Seriously. Some people struggle with that, right? Here's a really, really shallow one to me about suffering that I thought was pretty funny. On the 4th of July, they had the Lander Half Marathon. And Nancy's not here. Nancy ran it, okay? 13.1 miles. That's just like mind-boggling to me. My mom and dad ran it, and my sister ran it. And I didn't run it. Because that would be suffering to me. I knew I was smart enough to know ahead of time that I wasn't even going to try and run 13 miles. I'm good with 0.1 miles. That's about my maximum, right? So we stood at the end line and watched everybody come in. And for some people, 13.1 miles is suffering by the time you get there. My mom and dad aren't here. They went back to Montana, so I didn't throw them under the bus. My mom was suffering. That was a long run. And, you basically run up the mountain and back down. So the first half is a tough half. My sister, on the other hand, ran 13.1 miles, was so proud of herself that she's going to run a full marathon here like next month. So it was suffering to some, and it wasn't to my sister, to others. To me, any amount of running would be considered suffering. To my sister, any amount of running is considered joyful fun or something crazy.
Me too.
A really, really shallow example, but suffering is never exactly the same for everybody. Some people suffer through the loss of a loved one. Some people handle that with great strength and encouragement. Some people suffer through the loss of a relationship. That doesn't bother other people. Some people suffer with conflicts in relationships. Some people don't care what you think about them. Suffering is really unique because it's personal. It's personal, it's hard to define. We just know that when we get it, it sucks. But yet we're called to suffer. Let's unpack called to suffer just a little bit more, but in order to do that, I think we need to read our Bibles a little bit. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 14 through 18. Again, we dipped into the beginning of chapter 3 last week when we were looking at submit. That's the section about wives and husbands, about how wives should submit and husbands should love. And I think it played into submit a little bit. And you might notice I didn't get all the way to chapter 3, verse 14. So as I move through 1 Peter, I can't hit every single verse every single time. So this is a chapter you could go read chapter 3, in its entirety, and you'll pick the couple of verses that I missed before where I picked up today and the couple of verses that I missed after, because there's some really good verses in there. I don't think I'm trying to dodge them just because I had to pick up here in verse 14 instead of verse 8 where we left off. But like I said, at the end of where we were last week, the beginning of chapter 3, talking about submission, about husbands and wives. And then the few verses that I'm skipping here, verses 8 through 14, Peter is challenging Christians to be called holy, like he's already been challenging them in chapter 2, to be righteous, to submit to God. And so to be called holy, and part of that is that brotherly love that we talked about a couple weeks ago. So that's kind of the context we're back in as we get to chapter 3 in 1 Peter. So if you would, you got your Bibles? Let's read it together. But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that's God's will, than for doing evil. For Christ also suffered once for sins, for the righteous and the unrighteous, that he may bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but being made alive in the Spirit. Again, don't stop just because that's where I stopped on your own time. Keep reading, because I'm going to have to, I can't hit every verse, and 1 Peter is just full of so much good stuff. 1 Peter chapter 3, you pair that with the couple of verses I read out of chapter 2, and the first thing you get is that we're called to suffer as Christians. But then there's this next thing that Peter writes to Christians that just completely boggles our minds as humans. It's because right out of the gate in chapter 3, he says that suffering is actually a blessing? What? I don't know exactly what suffering is for everybody, but the way I defined it is not blessing, right? I said it stinks. It's hard. It's terrible. It's a blessing? Well, that's exactly what Peter said. Even if you suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. The idea of suffering is something that, if we look at it from God's eyes, from a Christian perspective, as a believer, it looks a little bit different than we would just default as a human, right? As a human, it stinks. As a Christian, we can say, wait a minute, this is a blessing from God. It's hard to wrap our heads around, though, because it still stinks. It's a blessing from God. How can it be a blessing from God? Well, Peter unpacks that a little bit more for us, right? He says, don't have fear, don't be sad, but instead of getting stuck in suffering, honor God. Oh, again, another easier said than done principle here in chapter 3. But if we really did what Peter's instructing Christians, us to do today, if we didn't focus on the ickiness of suffering and we focused on what God is doing and how great he is, I'm starting to see how this could be a blessing. But it takes a lot of work to focus on the right thing in the midst of a suffering, struggle, trial, whatever you want to call it. Because they're going to come. And it all depends on your outlook. They're going to come. It all depends on your outlook. So he says, honor God in the midst of suffering. And then in the middle of chapter 3 here, we have kind of like a famously quoted piece of scripture that we don't usually put with suffering. We usually take it out of context, which is never a good thing to do. I never advise anybody to take one verse out of the Bible because you can just make it say whatever, right? But here we have, in the middle of this one, we usually take out of context, Peter says, but instead, being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason of the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. Right there in the middle of chapter 3, we're talking about suffering and how we can have a different mindset. We really should have a different mindset. And then we have this verse we take out of context about apologetics, right? Always being prepared to make a defense about Christianity. People love that word defense in our culture, by the way, right? Like we talked about in Bible class. They're like, be prepared to make a defense. No. Peter's talking about suffering, and he puts this message from God in there about being prepared to make a defense for what? Did you catch it? For the hope that is in you. So we're talking about suffering this whole time, and he says, be prepared to make a defense for the hope that is in you. Why might you have hope? Because you are looking to God in the middle of suffering. And that ain't right. That's backwards. So you're going to have to make a defense for the reason that you have hope. To the world, to the people watching you, you have the opportunity now to make a defense of why you're hopeful in the midst of suffering. And the answer is because of Jesus, because of God, because of the inheritance we talked about in chapter 1 and chapter 2, because I get to sit on the throne with my Lord no matter what I go through on this earth. That's hope. That's hope. Seen a lot of good clips lately online. One of them was just like yesterday of old school Phil Robertson. He only looked 45 back then. And he was talking just for a few minutes about his Christianity. And one of my favorite things is when people bring this quote, and it's basically the idea of, well, if I'm wrong about Jesus, and I just stay in the ground and nothing happens after life, at least I had hope the whole time that you don't have. That's kind of a twisted way to think about it, but at the same time, he's right, isn't he? We have a hope. We have a hope of heaven. I do believe that heaven is real. Christ really died. He really was doing what he said he was doing. But even on the shallowest level, we have the hope that you don't have. So we need to give a defense for that, but do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, that even those who bully us, slander us is the term the Bible uses, even those that slander us may see Christ and be put to shame for the way they're slandering. So there's kind of a middle piece here of suffering. And then Peter goes on to say that we should suffer for doing good. Rather suffer for doing good, and that it's God's will, than for suffering for doing evil. Here's the thing that I got out of just that one sentence right there, and I've said it already. I gave away my sermon before we got here. You're going to suffer no matter what. You're going to suffer if you do good for Christ, because Satan's going to be after you, the world's going to be after you, they're going to target you and torture you. You're going to suffer for doing good. But you're also going to suffer for doing evil. It's called the consequences of sin. And we walk around and live normal lives, and we see people every day, and we can see suffering because of sin. We can see suffering because of the world. We can see suffering because of the original sin. So you're going to suffer either way. It's not very encouraging, but it's going to happen either way. So do it for God. Do it for good instead of evil. Suffer for Christ's sake. Why? Because Christ suffered for us. That's what Peter says. If you need a why to justify suffering, it's going to happen either way, so you don't get it out. But we have a really good why because Jesus suffered for us. Sometimes I think we can kind of forget about that because we know the story of Jesus on the cross so well that we forget the suffering. And sometimes we can start getting glimpses back into it, and we start talking about nails and hanging on a cross and not being able to breathe and all of this, and we're like, okay, that's suffering, I'm getting that. But this is one we can never completely understand. Bearing the sins of the entire world once and for all. I don't know what that suffering looks like. But I do know individuals who have to bear their own sin. It's suffering. So Jesus was carrying the whole world's past, present, and future. He really did suffer on the cross for us. That's the reason that we can suffer with hope today. Like I said, this idea, this picture of suffering is all throughout 1 Peter, and I've really kind of had to dodge it because I knew it was going to be its own sermon. And if you think about who 1 Peter is written to, it's written to Christians in exile who aren't in their homeland. And we talked about that aspect when it comes to submission last week. It's hard to submit to a land and a people you don't understand their laws and their reasons and all of that. But also think about the suffering that they're probably going through in these exiles. Know anything about the culture of that time, maybe even today's culture, is that if you ain't from there, you ain't nothing. Okay, maybe they didn't say it like that. Maybe that's how we say it up in Northeast Montana, right? We still get that to a degree. But they were probably suffering because they weren't locally from there. They were exiles in a foreign land. They understood what Peter was talking about when he was talking about suffering. And I think we understand what Peter's talking about when he's talking about suffering sometimes. Because we feel it. We see it in our families, whether it's from God or it's from sin. We feel it and we see it in ourselves, whether it's from God or it's from sin. We know that suffering exists. So let's suffer for God's sake. Peter's not done there, though. I got to move into chapter 4. Again, skipping a little bit of chapter 4. Go read it. Go find the first couple of verses. I'm not trying to skip them. But we're going to pick up here in verse 12. Read through 19. The last little bit I want to read about suffering that Peter's telling the church. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. Read before and after that in chapter 4 too. The first thing I see here in chapter 4, I'm just giving you the bullet points that I see, is one we already started talking about, but I love the phrasing that Peter uses. Don't be surprised. Don't be surprised when that fiery trial comes upon you. Don't be surprised when suffering comes. It's not an if, it's a when. Is it for God or is it for Satan? Either way, it's going to come, right? But instead of being surprised and depressed about it, he gives us the same thing that we're going to have to work on for the rest of our lives. I don't expect you to be fixed when you walk out of here, because I'm not. He says, but instead, rejoice in suffering. Okay. We've already talked about that in chapter 3, even in chapter 2 a little bit. That's the challenge that we're going to get to take away today. Looking at it from God's perspective of rejoicing in suffering. Why? Because we share that same suffering with Jesus Christ, just like he talked about in chapter 3. But he does give us a challenge. He does give us a challenge when it comes to suffering. Peter says, so if you're going to suffer and you need to rejoice in suffering, you need to be suffering for the right things. His challenge is suffer because you're doing good. And don't suffer because you're doing evil things. And he gives some fantastic examples, right? He basically says, don't suffer because you're in prison because you murdered somebody. A little expounded on the idea of murderer. He says, don't suffer because of that, but rather suffer because you're being persecuted as a follower of Christ. Suffer because of righteous reasons, might be the best way to say that. And in all of that, we can still rejoice because, go back to chapter 1, go back to chapter 2, we have the inheritance, we have the promise of eternity, and we remember the gospel of Jesus Christ. And through that, we should suffer like we're called to suffer according to God's will. I really reworked this one a couple of times trying to figure out how to make it really light and easy. And I thought about, have you ever really dug deeply into a sermon about suffering? And I said, unfortunately, you've got two camps, and I can't be in either one of them. You've got the sermons about suffering that are so not encouraging that end just kind of where I started with, you're going to suffer, it's going to suck. Have a good day. Praise the Lord. I'm like, okay, I don't want to do that. But also, I definitely can't do the other side of it that we see in mainstream preaching sometimes of, oh, you're a Christian, you'll never suffer. God will bless you, prosperity all around. No. So I'm like, where do I need to end up? Well, I've just got to take Peter, what Peter's writing here. Read again chapter 2, verses 20 and 21. Read again chapter 3. Read again chapter 4. Take it home and chew on it a little bit, because this idea of suffering is so ingrained in us as humans that it's bad. But Peter's saying it sure doesn't need to be, and it sure shouldn't be. And you will go through suffering, but it can be for the glory of God. And you can rejoice in your suffering because Jesus suffered for you. And no matter what you go through in this life, you will see him at the end. And so suffer for the right things. Suffer because you're a Christian. Not because you're stumbling, but because you're walking in the light. Suffer for those things. And I think we get to chew on that for a little while because that's hard to do. Rejoice in suffering, that's backwards in my human brain. But it's because of Jesus Christ. It's just a small glimpse of what he did for us. Just a small part that we can do in return. So check yourselves before you wreck yourselves when it comes to suffering. Because if you're suffering for the right reasons, you can glorify God for it. And if you're suffering for the wrong reasons, it's probably because you're suffering because you're in sin. So that's a little self-analysis. That's our favorite thing to do, right? Pointing at somebody, you got all the fingers pointing back at you. A lot of self-analysis when it comes to our suffering. Is it because God's teaching me something and I can rejoice? Or is it because I've done something that Satan has taken a hold of me in? Like I said, it's a challenge for us. Take it home, chew on it. We've only got 1 chapter and a half left of 1 Peter. So next week we'll be in the end of chapter 4. We'll dig into it a little bit. Talk about being leaders within the church, and we'll dig into chapter 5. And if you hear this sermon today, you might be thinking, well, suffering is not something I want. Nobody does. But like Peter says, I think it's going to happen no matter what as humans. So if you're not a Christian today, you want to enjoy, I don't know if enjoy is the right word, but flip the script on suffering and suffer for doing good instead of doing evil. Flip the script and suffer for serving God instead of serving Satan. This is your opportunity. You got a bunch of people that are probably suffering through life because of Jesus, and they'll walk alongside you. So if you're not a Christian today, this is your opportunity. But if you are a Christian, you've got the call to suffer for God's sake.